I'm James Baca, Faculty Advisor to the Urban Studies Club.
I'm Jimmy Peralta, President of the Urban Studies Club.
And we're here today for a Borough President Forum. We want students to know who the candidates are before they vote in that special election taking place in Queens on March 20th.
Hi, my name is Vivian Rivera. I'm the Secretary for the Urban Studies Club, and today we have 4 of the candidates coming in and ready and able to answer all questions necessary for our Queens College students who are interested in knowing what they can bring to the table as Queens Borough President.
My name is Esther Thomas. I'm an Assistant Secretary to the Urban Studies Club, and today we're here for the Queens Borough President Candidacy Forum, and I think that it's a very informative event because it allows the Queens College students to be informed as to who the candidates are and what they stand for and the topics in which they are for.
Anyway, press phone on the name. Okay.
Without further ado, I want to thank Queens College, of course, for their cooperation in making this happen, all the staff, all the help I got.
So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the one and only special forum for between the major candidates for the Queens Borough presidential race hosted by the Urban Studies Club, right here in our very own Queens College. As Professor Baca mentioned, I'm Jimmy Peralta. I'm the president of the Urban Studies Club, and I will also be the moderator for this special forum. With me today is our club officers, Vivian Rivera. Vivian. Who's our secretary, Amanda Menicini, who's our treasurer, Esther Thomas, who is our assistant secretary, and we also have our faculty advisor for the club, Professor James Baca. You have 3 minutes to make start.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to be here at Queens College. It feels like I'm back home because I'm a former Queens College student. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Costa Constantinides. My grandparents were immigrants who brought my dad here when he was 8 years old. My grandfather was a dishwasher and a short order cook in a Greek restaurant. My grandmother was a seamstress who sewed buttons on coats. They taught each other English on the train, going to work every day, and they came here for a better life. My family grew up here in Queens. I went to many of the local public schools, and then right here to Queens College, where I put myself through Queens College, working in KB toy stores as a toy store manager. I graduated back in 2005, and I had the opportunity to teach here in the political science department, urban studies department, and it's been an amazing opportunity to always come back and give back to this amazing campus. The New York Post called me a greedy progressive in 2014 because I was able to get a large amount of set aside of affordable housing, union jobs during construction and after, making sure that there were actually infrastructure like transportation added. And then, as I said before, every land use project, private or public, should have union labor attached to it. The men and women who build the buildings and work in the buildings should be able to afford to live in their neighborhoods. And you talk about the budgetary power, $40 to $70 million a year. I'm the City Council's environmental chairperson. We've worked on over 30 bills, including the Climate Mobilization Act, which is the largest emissions reduction policy in the country. I want to make sure that as borough president, we have a deputy borough president for sustainability and resiliency rather than having me being driven around in a black SUV with 2 drivers. I want to make sure that we solarize and green roof every city building in the borough. I want to double our green space. When Rikers Island closes, I want to transform it into a renewable energy island that can benefit environmental justice communities. When I talk about education, it's not just what goes on the roof, it's connecting our kids to solar, to having science in every school, STEM, technology, so they can get those good jobs in the 21st century, and making sure we're getting our kids out of trailers. Queens is #1 in trailers in our schoolyards. And then as your county executive, it's about coming up with ideas to better the borough, the entire borough. So it's making sure we have a borough-wide transportation plan.
I'm married, have 3 boys, live here in Fresh Meadows, Queens, not too far from the university, a couple blocks away. I'm running for Queens Borough President because we kind of needed an independent voice, just somebody different than the county machine, somebody different than politics as usual. And the real push is between 18 and 35. How many people here between 18 and 35 years of age? Raise your hands. Yeah. This is the reality I'm living in. Less than 1% of the registered voters are between 18 and 35 years of age, actively voting. And that means not just registered, not just fill out the form, but actively going out to the polling sites. 3% of our community votes. That means 3 people out of this room, stand up, 3 people right here, stand up for 1 second. These 3 people are making decisions for the rest of you. That's our voter turnout right now, at 3%. Please sit down, thank you. That's the impact. I want you to realize that you have the power because all you are registered voters, but your impact is not being felt or heard because we don't turn out to vote. Imagine if 1,200,000 active voters actually came out to vote. It would make a huge difference, wouldn't it? Yeah, our voices aren't being heard right now because we're not actively engaged. And politicians, again, act based upon voter turnout. I'm not a politician. I'm a parent. I have 3 boys. My youngest boy is 12 years old. My other 2 sons graduated from CUNY universities. I'm a parent who got fed up with politics as usual, started promises that never come true. People who show up only during election time, take pictures, and then they disappear again and come back out election time again. If we're going to do something different, it requires us to empower people to have a real voice at the table. You are the voice of the future, but you're being left out of these conversations. Decisions that are being made here now will impact us for the rest of our lives. And we have the conversation in all the communities. We're saying, what's the future look like for your children? What's the future look like for you? And are you a part of this conversation? Are they building for your interests right now? When you look at all the neglect that we had, it didn't happen overnight. It happened over years of neglect. Sometimes before they even sat here, but it's also during the time that they've all been elected to office as well. These are neglectful things that are impacting our lives, which the changes aren't coming fast enough. I've been an advocate for over 30 years. In the New York City Police Department, I was the founder of the National Latino Officers Association, worked with 100 blacks in law enforcement and the Grand Council of Guardians to fight against police brutality, illegal quota systems, and the abuses that were going on in our communities, especially toward our young black and Hispanic children, right? We've all been victims of it. How many of you have been stopped by the police before? You know, like that. All right, not too many in this room. When I go to other rooms, a lot of people put their hands up. These things have been part of the police department. Illegal quotas, illegal arrest quotas, illegal summons quotas have been around for many years. I've been an advocate for changing that, taking them to court, suing them over it. And if you go to our website, it's Miranda for Queens. You see 4 different documentaries that we engaged in, including the NYPD 12.
Thank you, Jimmy Vaca, to my colleague, best professor on Queens College campus. Sorry. I'm New York City Council member Donovan Richards. This is now my 17th year in government. I've been elected for 6 years, and it was an unfortunate incident that led me to my local council member's office before I was elected. I had a friend who unfortunately was shot and killed on the streets of Southeast Queens, and he was 19 years old, I was 18, and I was fed up. After looking at him in his casket, I walked into my local council member's office and said, I want to get involved in government. I never thought that I would ever sit here as an elected official, and I was sworn in, just to tell you, there's a difference between politics and purpose. I was sworn in March of 2013 on the anniversary of his death. I was born to teenage parents right here in Queens. I'm born and bred all over Queens because my parents did not, when I ran for office, necessarily in 2013 for that reason, because we had to make sure babies had Pampers during that time. We had to make sure our seniors had food, our public housing residents, electricity could get back on. So that's how I spent majority of my time when I began running for office. During my tenure as chairman of the during the Environmental Protection Committee, I secured $2 billion for Queens to work on the infrastructure gaps that we've had. So when you see flooding in our streets, that was a big area. Also, I also passed legislation that also mandates now the city to put green roofs or solar panels or wind turbines on every building in New York City, 3 stories and above in New York City. Then I moved on to chair the zoning committee, which gave me power over land use decisions in the city. And I'm happy to say that there's no one on this stage who's built more affordable housing in Queens than me. We're building 6,000 units of real affordable housing in the Rockaways. I literally just cut the ribbon on a building last week where studios on the beach are going for $300. Imagine that. Where can you get that in New York City? Then fast forward, I'm now the chairman of the Public Safety Committee, which gives me oversight over the NYPD. Very happy to have worked, in particular, to make sure that reforms are taking place in the NYPD. One area is marijuana justice, and I'm going to close out on that because I see Jimmy. Marijuana justice, where black and brown youth would go to jail over marijuana in Queens and all over the city, but yet if your complexion was different, you would go to Yale still or Queens College. So we changed the trajectory of how marijuana is done and how the city and how enforcement is done in that specific area. And then lastly, I'm building a new precinct in Queens. It's going to be the first precinct in over 40 years this has been called on, where we're actually going to have a community center space and also a food pantry in there. So we're trying to merge that relationship between the police department and our community. So we have a lot of work to build a Queens that works for everyone.
My first question first, before we get to the second segment. So candidates, understanding the situation of what is happening to CUNY with regards to extensive budget cuts by the state, which has affected thousands of CUNY students and faculty. So my question is, how have you supported CUNY in the past, and if elected, what specific actions will you take as borough president to address the needs for CUNY students and its staff?
So I remember when I was here, the tuition was $800 a semester. And then George Pataki ran for governor and said that he was going to give us a tax cut. Where have we heard that before? I got 37 cents more in my paycheck, but I got a $400 increase. I remember that all too well. I remember putting myself through school, working in the toy store, and having to have that monthly payment that we all have. We see budget cuts here on campus. I'm a member of PSCQ CUNY. I'm proud to be a member of PSC CUNY. And as your borough president, as your county executive, we have to fight for higher ed. I've been proud to make sure we make investments from my office in the city council. I know Barry Commoner Center, we're able to fund a brand new environmental pollution lab this past year, environmental science labs. As a borough president, I want to make sure the capital budget, we're able to make real investments here, but also when it's time to go to Albany, it's having those hard conversations. It's making sure that Albany understands what it is to be a CUNY student and how hard that you work for the money that you have and how important this is, because this is the best buy. It's a better buy than Harvard, right? A better buy than Yale. You're going to get a world-class education right here in Queens, but while you're working, while you're raising a family. While you're, taking care of family members, you're doing all of these things simultaneously, and we should be making sure we're supporting you in a larger way.
I graduated from New York City Technical College. I got my 4-year degree from John Jay College as well. I understand the importance of the CUNY system being available to us. I will be an advocate for anything that forgives our tuition and offers free education. I think there's been a number of proposals. In the past, we've had demonstrations not only on behalf of professors and the seniority, and we've also had demonstrations with the students about different civil rights activities on campus. I've been a participant at many of those rallies throughout the city of New York, and again, not in an elected capacity, but as the chairman for the National Latino Officers Association, and as a parent who has students in the CUNY system, and as a graduate of the CUNY system, when they invited me out. So I believe that we need to be the voice of any of the changes, any of the programs that are going to offer free tuition and tuition forgiveness. Because the fact that when students have to have that debt for so many years after they've graduated from school is something that should have been passed. We should also look at the history of this. College used to be free. Everybody remember that? All right. It used to be free for everyone. But when the population of the student party started changing and more people started taking advantage of it, then it became they had to start charging people for it because it was no longer just for the exclusive communities that had access to it. We need to go back to free education. We need to understand that the education process is a part of our future. It's the ones that opens doors for us and allows us to have a future in not only employment, but in owning our own businesses and doing different things. But if we're not advocating in that voice, then we've lost the combat, so to speak.
With PSC CUNY on fighting cuts to every CUNY facility, every CUNY in the city of New York. And also Inez Barron is also the chairwoman of higher education, so we've stood with her every step of the way in fighting for more capital dollars across the board for CUNY. Also in my capacity as being a member of the Queens delegation, which is comprised of pretty much all of the Queens Council members, we really used that opportunity to ensure that there were more investments led by our council delegation chair, Karen Costa, that there's more investments in all of the facilities across Queens. What could we do to ensure that colleges like Queens College, which my sister just graduated from a few years ago, see the investment that it needs? When you look at a budget, you look at somebody's priorities in the budget, it shows you who they are. And you look at how much it costs to house somebody on Rikers Island right now. $300,000 to house a person on Rikers Island for a year. This is a question of priorities for our city and our state. Why couldn't we take that money and reinvest it back into free college for many of the students sitting here? A $70 million budget, a $5.5 million expense budget. We should ensure that every CUNY facility is state-of-the-art, that every lab, that every gym, and part of that is going to take us all working together, just as many, I saw Mr. Katowski here, I think, many of us have worked together for the year, so we're going to have to continue to work, but it also takes advocacy on your part too. We all have to work together to make sure that CUNY is a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to introduce former Councilwoman Elizabeth Crowley, who just arrived, and we'd like to afford her the opportunity for a 3-minute opening statement.
Pleasure to be with the students and the faculty at Queens College, and of course to see my colleague again. I'm a big fan of Professor Vaca. He did a lot of good work, not only at the council, but for many years in the Bronx community boards that he worked at. No, I'm Queens, through and through. I was born and raised not to be a politician, but to follow my passions. And I found out in high school that I had a talent for the arts, and that's what drove me to FIT for my education in college. I studied art restoration. Afterwards, I worked on some of the greatest landmarks in New York City, became active with the union that represented me, the Painters Union, and as a graduate student studying urban planning and architecture, and being a young single mom at the time, raising 2 kids, really struggling like so many of the families that are in Queens today. It was through my union connection that I felt that I wasn't alone, and that there was a spot for me, a pro-choice, progressive woman on the city council. Mind you, I was living in a district that had only Republicans representing them in the council, 3 before me, and at the time when I got elected in 2008, with the help of my union and many other unions, I was elected as the first woman to represent the district, the first Democrat, and the first union member. When I got to the council, I wanted to make sure that I stood up for working people and against the status quo. Quickly, I was known as a reformer and a fighter. At the time, Mayor Bloomberg wanted to close firehouses to bridge a budget gap. We fought back and stopped it. We saved those fire companies. When the speaker at the time wanted to give discretionary dollars in such an unfair and uneven way, I fought back and led the fight to make sure that there's a policy in place today that every district gets its fair share off the island, and I brought in the Health and Hospital Corporation. All the while, the Department of Corrections was literally letting New Yorkers die without the health care they deserve. And I was one of the first to support the closure of Rikers Island, which is today the policy of the city of New York. Since leaving the council in 2017 was my last year, I started an organization to help more women run for office. It's called 21 in 21. Currently on the city council, there are only 12 out of 51 members that are women. There are some committees that don't even
people went overseas and fought and died on behalf of us to sit here and have our freedoms, but can't find adequate housing. So that's one. There's been a lot of proposals recently with the VA hospital in St. Albans, and we want to see that hospital continue to be a full-fledged hospital, these services expanded there. And lastly, I'll say that we need to make sure that there are resources. You know, a lot of veterans come home, and I work with a lot of veteran organizations across Queens. I actually fund a nonprofit out of my budget right now who's helping veteran groups expand their opportunities and knowledge of access, because right now a lot of people come home and don't know what's available to them. And what you find with a lot of the veterans organizations, there are a lot of people who served in wars 20 or 30 years ago, but we're not really connecting with younger veterans who are coming back home. So we're expanding our territory in that specific area by funding programming. Healthcare, while I will say in the borough president's capacity, it's more of a federal, I think, and state conversation, but I will say right now, the governor has proposed a $6 billion cut to Medicaid, and we need to all be concerned about that. When you think about CUNY and where those cuts are going to come from when they negotiate the budget, we have to fight to keep what we have right now and really ensure that we're fighting for more support in that area. Healthcare is a great equalizer. We need to make sure everybody has access.
Okay, my father and my brothers have been veterans and are veterans currently right now. And what we find is that healthcare has been a struggling aspect in terms of providing service to our veterans, along with homelessness, just overall the concept of providing the full service support that was needed. And there has to be a connection, right? Many of the hospitals here in Queens are failing right now. They're C-level rated. Trauma centers are not necessarily available to all of Queens. The healthcare is not available to all of Queens. So we need to make sure that there's a greater coordination system and accessibility. I believe for veterans, there are a number of private organizations and partnerships that you can create to provide the services that are necessary for them. In the National Latino Office Association, we have a veterans chapter where we work with veterans all the time, not only about looking for jobs, getting them the health care that they need, and often sometimes it's the services that the Veterans Administration has failed to service them sometimes. So we advocate for them actively, and we connect the dots for them and services not only in the local community, but as well as outside their communities, because sometimes people need to get out of their neighborhoods to have something different. So we have been working on that in a long-term project for the last 30 years, working with veterans who have been suffering a number of different types of crises. As the Queens Borough President, while they say it's not our direct responsibility, we are the voice of the community. Veterans are part of our community. We need to be one of the loudest voices advocating for the rights of veterans, for their health care, for their mental care as well, and to the things that are needed. They cannot be left behind, especially when they sacrifice so much for us. But again, and
we're here at Queens College, and you have a large number of veterans that attend the college here. We are home in Queens to more veterans than any other county in the state of New York, and that's something we're very proud of. The Borough President's Office needs to have a liaison who solely works on veterans' issues and causes. That includes not only health care, housing, and job opportunities. Far too many of our veterans come home and they're struggling and they need services. Many don't, and there are a lot of veterans. We're talking about tens of thousands. We need to make sure that we're building true affordable housing. Far too much of the real estate development in this borough has been for luxury, and our veterans have been left out. And the homelessness rate is far too high. Our health and hospitals are not in the best shape that they need to be. Queens needs another hospital with a trauma center. Our VA hospital needs to attract more doctors. We're underbedded as a borough altogether. So in addition to that, when you have a medical emergency, it takes a lot longer for our ambulance to get to the scene of an accident or a heart attack. Those are issues that can be solved with the help of a borough president.
Make sure we are recruiting veterans to our community boards. As part of my Office of Outreach and Diversity that I want to have in communities, it's reaching out to our veterans community as well and making sure that we're making those appointments to our community boards, so when we are talking about housing and services, that they're at the table, not just being talked about while someone else is at the table. I know in my own community, when they were building formerly homeless veterans housing, there were segments of my neighborhood that were calling it a homeless shelter. And we had to push back and stand up and say, no, these are men and women who have served our country, who've gone off to war and need help. We absolutely have to support this project and make sure it got built, and it got built, and I was so glad this year to be there on Veterans Day, to have breakfast and share it with them and talk about and make sure there's the services to get them the things that they need, whether it's the counseling, whether it's the job training. As borough president, we have the ability to make investments in healthcare. I was glad to work with the Queens delegation to bring $7.5 million into my own district, including a stroke center, which was desperately needed as someone who lost my dad to a brain injury. I know how important it is. Time is life. We have to make sure we're making those investments throughout the borough of Queens, and then operationally.
It's a yes or no answer, so it's going to be brief, I hope. Although in politics, who says yes or no? It's always a brief. Well, let's go. Council member, you mentioned community boards, and we learn about community boards here in Queens. CUNY students need to be heard and represented. Would you commit to appointing at least one member to each community board who would be a CUNY student? Councilmember Donovan?
Collier Anderson, stand up. CUNY student already appointed to a community board.
Oh, you're the one. Yes. Okay. I next want to get into the topic that several people have raised, and that is accessibility rights for the disabled. We're talking about accessorides, the lack of accessible train stations in Queens. How do we address inclusion in employment as well as transportation? So we have several questions concerning the disability community. Perhaps we can start with Councilmember Constantinides and then come back to Councilmember Richards and around.
I stood outside the Hunters Point Library just a few months ago and I laid out my plan for accessibility. Just to refresh everyone's memory, that library took 15 years to build, $41 million, glass from Sweden or Spain. The country starts with an S, but basically it's Spain. But it cost us an extra 2 years for it to get built. And because they had a star architect build it, it wasn't fully accessible. How is that happening? We need to have a borough-wide accessibility coordinator to review all of the capital plans that go out. I know in my own council district, we've unveiled 2 of our parks most recently that are 100% accessible, the highest rating you can get. We have to make sure that we are making our public spaces accessible. Then when you talk about the MTA and transit, too often they're sending, the new bus plan is sending us to either the airport or a train station that's probably not accessible. We need to have someone fighting with the MTA that can get us those elevators, because the elevators should be a right. I know the only elevator they put in my neighborhood had connectivity to LaGuardia Airport. Even though they redid everyone there, we need to have on a borough-wide level a real accessibility plan. And we need to make sure that we're bringing people to the table, accessoride, having hearings, working. We know it's not working. It's how do we fix it? It's hearing from the men and women who are dealing with it every single day, who are feeling that they'd rather take an Uber or a Lyft. That's contributing to our carbon footprint. We actually have to make accessoride work for everyone, and by doing so, we improve the entire community.
And I'm happy to have actually worked, especially when it comes to the Taxi Limousine Commission. It's very complicated and difficult for New Yorkers who are handicap accessible to get access to our cabs. But then also if you're black as well and brown, if you live in a certain neighborhood, the TLC is not accessible to you. It's very hard to get a cab in Manhattan. I'm a council member. If I wave my hand outside City Hall for a cab, I can't get one as a black man. So one of the things that I did is I actually passed legislation which created the Office of Inclusion in the TLC, which has just ramped up. Happy to say that there's now a dedicated unit in the TLC that is there to work just specifically on discrimination. So if you're handicap accessible, if you feel because of where you live at, your socioeconomic status, because of the color of your skin, your religion, you are being discriminated against by the TLC, that office is now tasked, a citywide office, with reviewing that and holding people accountable who discriminate against us. The second thing is, you mentioned assess a ride. It needs to be assess a buy, because it's failing everyone. I mean, if you are a senior, if you are handicapped, you cannot get access to assess a ride. They do not actually keep their appointments. They make people late to school, I'm sure, if you're in this room. So we have a lot of work, and part of the problem we have is the state, although the city also provides funding to assess a ride, The state oversees it. We need to take it out of the state's hand and run Access-A-Ride as a city ourselves so that we can bring fairness to the program.
Handicap access and accessibility, right? And again, let me follow this. And I have family members that need that kind of accessibility. Their life going to be in a wheelchair for life, right? For the disabilities that they have. When you have these plans that you see, and you say some buildings took 14 years to develop, and then you say 14 years later we just discovered that it didn't have accessibility. That's a challenge, right? How many millions of dollars are we investing, not only in the revamping of the train stations that we just recently had, also no elevators for the elderly, no elevators for the handicapped. Where was that? How is that being done? And we don't have that information ahead of time. How is the accessibility for disabled people not part of the conversation? How is it not up front when we're starting the design plans and the discussions that were going on? How are they leaving this out of the equation? This is a failure in all parts of our representatives of not having the foresight to make sure that these are one of the questions that are asked at the beginning of the planning and make sure that it's implemented in the end, especially when they spend so many years of identifying the plans that we have. The other night we were out canvassing, and then we ran into the same thing. Somebody on hospice care came home, and a woman was running down the street asking for help. The ambulance didn't even bring them home. They put them in their private car and sent them home. An elderly couple. She couldn't lift them up the stairs in the wheelchair. We're out there canvassing. It took a few of us to lift them up, to get them into the house, then to place them in the bed. Where's the services, where's the extra things that are supposed to be provided by a healthcare system to provide that kind of accessibility? Instead of providing the ambulance to drive them home, they dumped them in a car and they told the wife to take them home. Again, so we need an overall plan that has accountability where we're at the table. We can no longer wait for these things to be built and figure it out afterwards.
So I was one of those young single moms with 2 kids that pretty much needed to be in a carriage, and it was very frustrating for me, and I know it is currently for many parents who don't have a car to get their kids to daycare so they can go to work. So we're hurting our most vulnerable communities because we don't have true accessibility. When it comes to Access-A-Ride, average ride is $75. When one could take an Uber, get better service, track it, make sure it's on time, for a fraction of the cost. Our MTA is wasting tens of millions of dollars on a broken system called Access-A-Ride. That needs to be fixed. Queens is a transit desert, first and foremost. I have a plan, unlike any of my opponents, that could open access to rail and provide opportunities for true transit enhancement, and that could happen by opening our railroads that are currently used, that are just being used for freight and not moving passengers. Makes no sense.
Not handicapped, they're disabled. And that is important, and all of them are making a contribution here, but they seem to be left out of the discussion by the state. And I thank the candidates for talking about that, and I certainly wanted to get a question in. And do any of the candidates have a position on what they want to do in Sunnyside Yards? And are candidates concerned about transportation there, city services, and gentrification due to displacement? Why don't we start with Mr. Miranda?
We are organizing and at the demonstrations with the groups over there against the Sunnyside Yards project. Again, imagine the kind of conversations we're having, air trains, billion-dollar projects, when we haven't fixed the problems that are facing the neighborhood right then and there. We want to invest in a $1 million project of luxury development again, when we haven't fixed the neighborhood which is right next door to it, public housing, haven't provided the services. Doesn't make any sense anymore. So when you see these conversations going on, I call it the distraction. They try to distract you from the real problems we have. If we can afford to pay billions of dollars to do all these projects, then we should have been able to pay billions of dollars to fix the problems that we're currently suffering. So I am with and been organizing with the groups over there, because I believe it's important. We cannot allow that to happen again. Again, luxury development, while it's not in some of the city council districts, every city councilman had to sign off on the approval of these luxury projects. So when they sit and say, I protected my community, many of them sold off the other communities as part of Queens. We have to have a unified voice in this project. We're talking about a moratorium on all of the luxury development in Queens. Until they had a feasibility study to determine what the strain on the local resources is going to be. They're dropping hundreds of families in the middle communities, and they haven't done the work to see what the strain is going to be on the healthcare system, on the public school system, on the transportation system. They're trying to figure that out after the fact. So again, we can no longer afford to allow these things to go forward without having voices at the table. It requires organization, it does require protest, it requires people getting together, and the Queens Borough President has the ability to have public hearings on this issue, and we will hold public hearings on this issue.
Along the 7 train line or the E train are 2 major transportation lines that take you from east to west. You know, when you get on that train certain times of the day, good luck if there's space enough for you to fit on that train. Our platforms are the most overcrowded. When it comes to Sunnyside Yards, I look at what the city did at the west side of Manhattan, Hudson Yards. It cost $1 billion to plank over 1 square acre, an acre of land. And it's going to be the same cost here in Sunnyside Yards. Earlier I talked about my transit plan. Well, coming right near there is one of these freight lines. It's known as the Tri-Borough extension. And in fact, the Bronx is going to be running trains, passenger trains on those lines. So, but we have no stop coming to Queens over there. And that's one of many lines we have where we need to open up, and you don't have to plank over acres of land to build. We need to make sure any plan to build involves community. EDC excludes the community. We saw that. We saw that happen in Long Island City. And we had the most highest densely populated growth anywhere in the country happen in Long Island City with little option for affordable housing. It's not right. We must learn from those mistakes, and we must increase public transit and not look to burden those lines that are already overburdened.
The administration's Economic Development Corporation is a complete disaster. We saw that with Amazon, where they made a deal in the middle of the night and kept the community out of that deal. They were we wanted to give away that land for Amazon to develop so that maybe we get those jobs, but no transit plan, no plan for issues around gentrification and making sure the residents can afford to stay in their neighborhood. And then I can tick off, URLIC, Amazon, BQX, Sunnyside Yards, and the list goes on and on and on, where they're supposed to be an economic development corporation. They're not focused on the small businesses that make Queens run. So the small businesses are the largest employer, and I'd rather start celebrating those small businesses and helping those small businesses rather than seeing EDC consistently put forth an agenda that's just about development, development, development. We need to have a stronger voice in the Borough President's office to say no. I mean, Hudson Yards, Related had open shop. And the union, I was the lead sponsor of the Count Me In Reso to make sure that we actually had union labor. These developers want to actually have a race to the bottom every single time, where they're not paying the men and women who build the buildings and work in the buildings a living wage. So when you talk about development, you talk about real and community engagement, everyone in the community, including public housing residents, and not just saying it's resume workshops and job fairs, but real connectivity to what's happening there in the future. And talking about transit, talking about resiliency, because it's great to build a little castle, but what happens when you build a little wall? On a floodplain, that water is going to come in around it. So they may protect their own development, but the flood waters when they come are going to come around that development and flood in the rest of the neighborhood. So we have to do better, and we can't just allow EDC to run roughshod over us time and time again.
Far Rockaway, for any of you who know what downtown Far Rockaway looked like, we had 40 years of blight in a downtown area, no access to fresh food, no access to good parks, decrepit conditions in public housing, no infrastructure. When it rained, ladies have to push their strollers in the street because they have to try to avoid the ponding. But we changed the trajectory of that when I came into office. We secured about $300 million in infrastructure for downtown Far Rockaway. 1,900 units set aside for real affordable housing, not that question of affordable to whom. The residents of the neighborhood could afford the development. Not only that, we got a 15% set aside for homeless families. So while people talk about ensuring homeless families have permanent housing, we're actually doing it. We got $20 million, 10 of it set aside for a new park, but I said, no, if we're gonna do $10 million for a new park, what about the conditions that the public housing residents park has been in for 20 years. So we got $10 million matched for that. Then we started speaking about new schools. And then I said, wait a minute, what about the lack of technology, the lack of good gyms for the existing schools? We got $20 million for existing schools. I talked about the flooding in the street. We got $139 million of infrastructure money to fix the streets, 2 public plazas. That's what I want to see for Sunnyside Yards. There can be no development deal in Queens that does not have real affordability and it does not take into account the issues that have plagued the communities that have been there, like the Queensbridge houses, the Astoria houses, Woodside. You have all of these developments that have been in decrepit conditions, and we need to make sure that even as new things happen, that the city is subsidizing to fix the long-standing issues that residents have had to deal with. So right now, I would say no until we negotiate further. Thank you.
At capacity, because people cannot afford to take them. It's time for our borough to get a reduced price on those Long Island railroads. That we run more trains more frequently so more people could move on them. That we take the lines that I mentioned earlier and start moving people on them.
Forum was standing room only, and it still is. And I just hope we have enough pizza in the back. That's all I can tell you.
Pizza?
We have pizza in the back. I do want to remind you all that the election is on March 24th.
Early voting on March 14th.
Early voting is March 14th.
To the 22nd.
There's early voting, March 14th it begins, and you have to find out where in your community that is. And then on March 24th is the actual special election where any voter can vote. Also, go to the Instagram of the Urban Studies Club. Please give us a hit so you can find out what we do. It's called Urban Studies QC. And we'd love to have you join. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the college again. Thank the candidates. I would like the executive board of the Urban Studies Club to come up so we can get a picture for the candidates for our Instagram account.